Well, thanks for this opportunity to talk about dry farming grapevines. Now, I'm the viticulture extension specialist based on main campus in Corvallis, but I have a statewide appointment for uh, reaching the grape industry across Oregon. And most of the work that I've done in the last 18 years that I've been at OSU has been on dry farming wine grapes. Next slide. So a lot of people question whether wine grapes can be dry farmed. In reality, they're one of the easiest crops to dry farm. In the case of grapevines, I'll talk about a couple different aspects, but first, climate, absolutely important, as well as the soil characteristics that one is growing on across the state of Oregon. We've got differences in climate and soil characteristics that really impact how we go about dry farming and whether it even can be done. And of course, where I am located in the Willamette Valley on the western part of Oregon, we certainly have all of the characteristics that make dry farming wine grapes possible. And of course, there's plant traits that we can consider that will make it much more successful. And so I'll talk about each one of those this morning. Next slide. So in terms of the climate and vine growth for grapevines, they're naturally drought tolerant and nutrient efficient relative to many other perennial crops. Now, where I'm located, we get anywhere from 38 to 42 or 45 inches of rain annually, and that is generalized across the Willamette Valley, AVA, or Willamette Valley zone that runs from basically Portland down to the Eugene area. And the most of the rainfall, of course, occurs from October to May. Most of our grape growing cycle, we start bud break around mid of April, and then we have bloom. So bud break and bloom and grapevines are separated. Bloom is about 2 months later in mid-June. And so we're still in the relatively high soil moisture time slot when we go through bud break to bloom. So there's a lot of rapid shoot growth. By the time we get into midsummer and into ripening, ripening is starting usually around mid-August and we're harvesting in September. So we hit most of the season with adequate rainfall or excuse me, adequate soil moisture. So in terms of what do we need for soils in vineyards? Well, a lot of people like to focus very heavily in viticulture on specific soils and how they relate to, having best wine quality, but you can grow grapes on a lot of different soil types. It's just going to be a difference of how much you're going to struggle on the site. And we really focus more on these characteristics. So adequate soil depth. So the effective rooting zone needs to be enough so that you have good, healthy growth. And that is going to be one of the biggest drivers in how the vines grow and how much you can dry farm. And generally speaking, this also relates to what the plant material is. So if they're European wine grapes, the Vitis vinifera, they are generally deeper rooted than if you have American Vitis rootstocks or American Vitis species. So something like a Concord grape is going to be relatively shallower than a European wine grape. Now, all of the industry or the 99% of the industry in Oregon is growing Vitis vinifera, the European wine grape, and most of them are on American rootstocks. So they can work with shallower soil depths, but that also has a counter effect of having potentially less soil moisture. All of the soils should have good drainage. Grapevines do not like wet feet. And the soil should have moderate water holding capacity, and this could be anywhere from 7 to 12 inches of water holding capacity that we typically see in a lot of the soils that we are growing grapes on in the Willamette Valley. We do tend to have acidic soils in this region, so anywhere from 5.2 to 5.6 is pretty common that we see. And to get to a more neutral pH, there's a lot of liming that occurs. But generally speaking, grapevines can handle soil pHs between 5.5 and 7.5. So they're pretty flexible, and especially with different types of rootstocks that are possibly more tolerant to acidic soils than we typically see with own-rooted European grapevines. So next slide, please. So I wanted to show just some soil moisture patterns from some work that I've done here in the Willamette Valley for a lot of the growing seasons. I spent a lot of my time looking at soil moisture, which is really helpful just to understand the plant's physiology and how they respond. And what I find a lot of times is that people feel like they don't need to look at soil moisture because they don't irrigate anyway. But it's oftentimes really helpful just to understand differences in soil types, and we're using research grade equipment when we're looking at the soil moisture. And this is just a snapshot of 4 years of a research trial that we did in a commercial vineyard where they had three distinct soil types. So the upper picture there that shows a blue, green, and pink blocks were just three different soil types that were represented in the region. And the picture on the bottom is me holding one of the soil probes in a pit before I put it in. You can see the type of probes that went into the ground. We put these under the vines at 18 inches of depth and then 36 inches of depth. We also put them in the alleyway, so between the vine row. And so this is just a summarization of 4 different growing seasons from January through December. One of the years we stopped in later parts, so you'll see that line doesn't go through. But for the most part, we monitored year-round the soil moisture. And we start out at a pretty heavy, pretty high soil water content, basically field capacity from basically December through May. And then in May is when we start to see that soil moisture decline. We get to our lowest amount of soil water content by the time we get to July or August, because that's our dry season. And then after the growing season is over, we basically refill that soil profile pretty quickly. So we go through most of the season with adequate soil moisture at the 18-inch depth. Now, if you'll go to the next slide. Now, many of you probably think or have heard that grapevines are deeply rooted and they really, all the roots are really far down. While a lot of the roots can be very far down, the most of the roots that are in grapevines are within the top meter of soil. So definitely within the top 36 inches of depth. So this is the 36-inch depth. Obviously, we still see that field capacity until we get to about June, and then it starts to decrease as we get into that dry season. But we still go through the most of the growing season with a pretty high amount of water, soil water content as we go through the growing season. So we saw there was plenty of water in these soils. This was a dry farmed vineyard, a mature dry farm vineyard. And so next slide, I want to show some of the distribution of the soil types. So I know there's a lot of graphs here, but I wanted to showcase what differences we saw in this vineyard based on the different soil types. So we did have Andy Gallagher, so we've heard his name come up a couple times this morning. He classified the soils, did the soil testing for us, and we found that we had 3 different soil types that are very common to grape growing in the Willamette Valley, and these include Dupie, which is a sedimentary soil, Somme, which is a volcanic, and then we also had Woodburn Willamette, which is a glacial deposit soil. They had differences in soil effective rooting or depth to bedrock. So some were more than 60 inches. The Somme was shallower at 47 to 55. And then the available water holding capacity ranged from 7 to 12 inches. Now, one thing to look at in this figure, you could see each one of these years from 2020 to 2022, there's one soil type that always had lower soil moisture, which is the purple, the Woodburn Willamette. And then one of the orange and the blue tended to be a bit higher, or the Somme was the kind of turquoise color, was always a little bit higher soil moisture. So it gave us an idea of clearly there's differences in soil moisture. Could this be due to the physical properties or how the grapevines are growing in place? Because this is under vine at 18 inches. Next slide, please. So this is the 36-inch depth. And what we see here is that, again, the same patterns emerge where Woodburn Willamette, the glacial deposit soil, had the lower soil moisture relative to the other two. And at different times of year, there was kind of a shift on as to which soil type was higher. For example, Dupie was higher early season, but then became lower than Somme, the volcanic soil, during that heat of summer when we get the driest. So that was kind of interesting to see. Next slide, please. So the big question became, what what happened with these vines. And one of the things that I want to showcase first is what happens in the different years. So I already mentioned that field capacity was reached, so the soil profile was full by each November, and the inset graph here kind of shows the whole growing season relative to what, so the lines are the soil moisture, the bars are the rainfall events. And so we see that the refill of the soil profile happens very rapidly in late October, early November. By the time we get into December, we're at field capacity. We stay there until we get to spring. And then we see the different years based on the precipitation we saw. There's differences in how the dry down, or when the dry down begins. So in 2020, that dry down began late, so mid-June. In 2021, our driest year of the study, it happened in April. Then in 2022, we saw that it was mid-June again. So 2021 in particular, which I've shown in the inset graph, showed these differences in how we saw a shift to lower soil moisture earlier in the growing season. That did impact how the vines grew, of course. We found that the largest vines were in the deepest soil. The smallest vines were in the most restricted layer, soil with the most restrictive or shallower soil. And it did impact ripeness as well at harvest. So next slide, please. So we did monitor plant water stress throughout this. And again, these vines were not irrigated. And we wanted to explain, we see this soil moisture. We wanted to see what is this temporal water stress that we see. And we found that the shallower soil, the Dupi, had the more stressed vines. So when you look at these graphs, the orange is that sedimentary soil. A lot of grape growers know if they've got sedimentary soils, their vines are going to be more stressed. We documented that here in this study. And we found that indeed, through most of the time that we look at water stress from July through early September, we see that those vines were indeed more water stressed than the other two soil types. And the vines grew different as a result of that. So next slide, please. So here's a pictorial example of what these vines looked like. Pictures taken on the same day, right before harvest. We have here the pruning weights that also go with them. So you can see big differences in the canopy density as well as the canopy color. And the Dupi had much smaller vines, at least it looked that way until we looked at the pruning weights. When pruning weights we take in the dormant season, it's a great way of kind of determining vine size. We saw that the Psalm vines actually had the smaller pruning weight, which might be deceptive based on these pictures, but when you were in the vineyard, you could see they had shorter shoots and the vines were usually more ripe. So the fruit was more ripe off the volcanic soil than the Dupi, and the woodburn Willamette had the biggest vines. Probably, as you can see in these numbers, almost double the size of the canopy in the woodburn Willamette versus the Psalm, and about 25% greater than in the Dupi. Next slide, please. We also looked at nutrient status. And so this was very interesting to see these vines, the nutrient status. This is leaf blade at veraison. This is very indicative of canopy size, usually that we have higher nitrogen with bigger canopies. This also can lead to differences in fruit composition, and nitrogen is important for fruit for fermentation. And we saw that certainly the Psalm, which had smaller vines, also had lower amounts of nitrogen, almost to the point of deficiency. But still within a sufficiency range, but getting lower there. The Dupi was okay, and the woodburn Willamette was clearly much higher total nitrogen in their leaf blades, or at least from a concentration standpoint. Next slide. So basically from this trial, we found that the vineyard floor, in doing this work, we looked at the soil patterns, but we also did some vineyard floor management work where we did till versus no till. And what we found from that was that we were able to also alter the soil moisture, or not so much the soil water availability. We did have some impact on some of the vine growth, but not as much as we would have thought. The biggest thing we saw in that trial was across the 3 different soil types is that vineyard floor management was absolutely unnecessary in the Woodburn Willamette soil. So leaving a no-till system was not going to cause any problem or any benefit by going in and tilling in a soil that had plenty of soil moisture and plenty of nutrition. So leaving it alone and doing no-till would be ideal. In the soil that had somewhat of a shallower soil, so the Dupuis and the Somme benefited from doing some tillage. So we did till or no-till. The no-till did have less nutrients and less canopy size. So there is benefit to knowing your soils, knowing your soil moisture, so that you can make these adjustments based on how you want to do tillage or not. Then also, when we look at managing dry farming, there's some other things we can think about longer term. So short term, we do vineyard floor management if you're not going to irrigate. If you're longer term, you can look at things that will help you with vineyard design. So selecting the proper site and selecting the proper plant materials. So specifically, I want to focus on rootstocks, work that we've been doing on that. Next slide, please. So this is a table that I just want to outline about rootstock availability for growing wine grapes. Most vineyards commercially throughout the world are grown on rootstocks. The 3 that you see in orange boxes are the top 3 that are used here in Oregon, if not also being own rooted. So those are the most common, and we use a very small percentage of the available rootstocks out there with parentage that is really not drought tolerant. So the Vitis riparia and rupestris are 2 parents that lead to rootstocks that are not drought tolerant. They help reduce vine vigor, which is often desired in regions like Western Oregon where we get a lot of rainfall because you don't want too much vine vigor when you're growing wine grapes. But there are a whole bunch of different parentage, especially Vitis berlandieri, that can lead to drought tolerance. And we've been doing rootstock evaluations since 2020 in several trials here in Oregon. Next slide. So here's an example of how different the growth response is with Pinot Noir grown on 2 different rootstocks. This is done in a replicated trial at our OSU Woodhull Vineyard near Monroe, Oregon. On the left is 5BB, so Pinot Noir on 5BB rootstock. It's a well-known drought-tolerant rootstock. This is at harvest, very big canopies, thick canopies, and it's hard to tell maybe in this picture, but these vines clearly outgrow the canopy, so the top training wire you can't even see, whereas in the picture on the right, you see smaller vines. They're not filling the canopy completely up to that top wire, and they have some yellowing leaves, which is not a bad thing. You can see some of those during harvest, but they clearly have much smaller canopy sizes. So this is the 2 extremes that we see in our rootstock trial. This is a dry farmed project that has been dry farmed for more than 15 years, and it's at a traditional density for most grape vineyards, and it's no-till as well. So next slide, please. Here's Pinot Gris, also in this project. It's 5BB on the left and 4453, another rootstock that is typically not as drought tolerant and not as nutrient efficient. So the canopies are smaller, less green, starting to see some leaf coloration change. So we see that rootstocks can have a very profound impact on how the vines grow and how drought tolerant they are. Next slide. So one of the things that we do when we look at vegetative growth of grapevines, we do the pruning weight. So we assess pruning weight and see how they respond. This is just a graph showing the differences in the pruning weight over a 4-year period, and sharing the information from that 5BB, which is the largest grapevines. They're considered overly vigorous. And most of the rootstocks fall in that optimum zone, that 0.2 to 0.4 pounds per linear feet. But we see that some just are not handling the drought as well in the long term. It's 4453 and Riparia glor, also Schwartzman, really devigorated. But all of the others, we've got a lot of rootstocks to pick from, depending on the soils and the site that somebody may want to consider for dry farming wine grapes in the long run. Next slide, please. And this a lot of times people think, well, what about yields? How are yields affected when we have these different rootstocks? And pretty much all of them do pretty well. So I put the line for 1.0 pounds per linear foot being the minimum you would want for a grapevine on a certain rootstock. Usually some growers probably want a bit more than that, but this is from that 4 or 5 year data that we have. We see that the Riparia Glor, the 4453, the Schwartzman, they really are very low yielding. That's not surprising. The canopy sizes are much smaller when dry farmed. And then we see that a lot of them are just fine in between. They grow great canopy sizes. They have reliable fruit yield. And some, the 5BB, the 420A, they have very high yields, also higher canopy size. So you won't be compromising yield too much by doing dry farming if you select the right rootstock. Next slide, please. So we look a lot at vine water stress response. And one thing I want to clarify is that when we're looking at water stress response, we're trying to give guidelines to growers so that they don't have to do these measurements all the time, but they can select rootstocks that might be really helping them manage not only short-term water stress, but long-term water stress. From a short-term water stress standpoint, this is what we're doing. We're going to the field, we're measuring leaves, whether it's a pressure bomb or a pressure chamber that we use to measure the xylem pressure, or we're doing stomatal conductance. Next slide, please. And I'm wrapping up, Tegan. I see you stepping in. So key takeaway here is I want to just mention from this work, which ones are our winners for drought tolerance. So in Pinot Noir studies we've done, the typical drought tolerant rootstocks of 1103 Paulson, 5BB, they're the most drought tolerant. Our typical ones that we grow here in the Willamette Valley are not as drought tolerant. Does it mean that they're not going to be good? Not necessarily. It all depends on how you manage your soils. Next slide. And then Chardonnay and Pinot Gris, we do have slightly different rootstocks we've looked at, but the same takeaway is that some of the most drought tolerant rootstocks show up as drought tolerant in our Chardonnay and Pinot Gris studies. But I do want to point out that 10114, a very common rootstock that people grow here in the Willamette Valley, actually performs better on white varieties than Pinot Noir from our studies. Next slide. And so final considerations for dry farming is that a lot of growers in the Willamette Valley already are dry farming wine grapes, whether they intended to or not. It's just really quite easy to do. The goal is not to stress the vine. It's a metric that they are looking for. And a lot of times growers aren't measuring it with a water stress machine like my lab is. They're usually looking at vine size and yield and that healthy balance between the two. And really the goal in a lot of farming certifications is to not necessarily use water if it's not needed. And so we tend to see a lot of adoption of dry farming just because of all of these components coming together. I think that's it.
Amazing, Patty. Thank you so much.